It's time for the Bible Geek. I am that geek. Robert M. Price, postmodern, deconstruct, super-powered demigod. It's January 4th, 2015. Incredible. I'm sure my check writing will catch up with that eventually. I was thinking, do I even use checks anymore? Oh, yeah, they're those bills, right. Anyway, this is the Bible Geek. This is Robert M. Price, the eponymous geek himself. Gee, I'm not sure I used the word eponymous correctly there. What the heck. I wanted to work my way through some more of those exciting Bible Geek questions. And this one is from Abdel Daoud, first prophet of the Aten. Oh, let's see. Okay, got an accent request. There are puzzles with Mark, especially in its relation or lack of it to Paul. Scare quotes around both names as if, we're not quite sure really who wrote them, which I'm in agreement with. Paul seems to know of no earthly life of Jesus, while Mark speaks of nothing else, even less than subsequent Gospels. Yet you've touched on similarities before, in particular the belittling of the 12, that is, in both like Galatians and Mark. In a related vein, the branches of Pauline Christianity and historical founder Christianity appear almost to be independent. It seems odd that they influenced each other so little, as if there were two separate Jesus tracks. Even though Mark portrays an earthly Jesus, his stories appear to be derived not from a recent historical visit of Jesus, but from the Old Testament. As compelling as the Christ myth theory is, a point that apparently makes it difficult to accept is that Mark knocked the Christology down several pegs from Mark's heavenly Superman. Is it possible that the low Christology of Mark is really a misreading? What if Mark is not writing of Jesus the man, but of the early travels of Paul's heavenly Savior, a set of what would super Jesus do stories? Let's say Mark is a follower of the heavenly Christ figure, but feels that it is too abstract to appeal to the masses. So he writes a fictional account of the Christ spirit interacting with mortals as a way for us mundanes to relate to the divine. Thus the gospel effectively begins with the indwelling of the Spirit at baptism and ends with its departure on the cross. There's no resurrection account because the real death and resurrection occurred to the heavenly Christ, as Paul describes. I find it fascinating that not only is there no birth narrative in Mark, there is no attempt to paint him as an individual at all before the baptism, almost as if he'd faded into existence 3 days before the Spirit descended, just as he faded away 3 days after it departed. Marcion sort of thought that, and that's one reason some think that Mark's Gospel means Marcion's Gospel. Anyway, if this were Mark's thinking, I'd say he succeeded, given the acceptance of the historical Jesus and the number of derivative works. Those works then confirmed Mark's lowered Christology, partly by attempting to re-elevate it. That brings up the question of whether Matthew and Luke recognized what Mark was doing. Did Mark intend anyone to see through the fiction? Was he recruiting for Pauline-like Christianity, or deliberately creating his own branch? The Messianic Secret motif does seem to me to imply that Mark was aware that he was writing fiction and trying to obscure the fact. You're not sold on Mark creating the gospel out of whole cloth. You consider Mark created it from sources. One thing that puzzles me about that is, why are Mark's sources creating stories from the Old Testament? Was there a team of gospel elves, each creating Old Testament stories? Could this somehow be a recognized technique that several narrators used? It does seem odd that the Old Testament stories would make it intact into oral tradition. Wouldn't it be more likely that stories created in this specific manner were crafted by a single individual? If it wasn't Mark, if our Mark is also incorporating independent oral tradition, can I push the concept back to a proto-Mark whose work the gospel writer copied and extended? Perhaps again without recognizing that it is fiction that he's reproducing, although I'd say the Messianic Secret argued against that. We'll just pause right there and get this interesting point out of the way. William Vreda, who came up with the Messianic Secret hypothesis, said that Mark, or the author of our gospel according to Mark, is inconsistent in his use of the Messianic Secret, implying that he has inherited it, but has begun to fail to understand that in the same process by which Matthew and Luke, and then of course John, eventually abandoned the secrecy model, and so that there would be a proto-Mark even on that hypothesis, a slightly earlier version of the Gospel of Mark. And one other thing before we read the rest of the question, always a dangerous option. Assuming that Marcion believed in a purely mythic Christ, and that even the Marcionite gospel, an earlier, shorter form of what we call Luke, was the product of Marcionites, not of Marcion himself, which I tend to think is the case. I think Marcion's gospel was originally just the preaching of the heavenly Christ, and that it had nothing to do with the 12 and all that. I think that we have to envision, we could attribute to Marcion the central notion of the repudiation of the Hebrew God and the Hebrew Scripture. And if that's all he did, then we'd still have recognizable Marcionite Christianity. And that would account, I think, for the fabrication of earthly Jesus stories by subsequent even Marcionites, by rewriting Old Testament stories of other characters. They couldn't. It's a very similar procedure to the way the emerging Catholic Church would reinterpret the Old Testament stories as typologies of the coming Christ, so it's almost unrecognizable to Jewish readers, right? That they've rewritten the Old Testament by reinterpreting it as being predictions and types of Jesus Christ. Well, what the Marcionites would have done, I think, was to have salvaged various Old Testament materials in the only way they had left, that they simply rewrote them as being about Jesus, as if, like you say, Jesus had appeared on earth. And that they probably did to counter the historicizing tendency that began with emerging Catholicism, nascent Catholicism, as it's also called. That is, there was this jockeying among the different types of early Christianity for some credential that would prove each one to be true and the genuine article. And it helped to make such claims if you said that there was an actual founder, and that was the real Jesus, and he taught his disciples who taught our teachers. Now, Gnostics and Catholics both said this. The whole apostolic succession of bishops thing. Jesus taught the 12 and they taught the bishops. That's a Catholic version, but it's very similar to the Gnostic version, where we're told that Valentinus claimed to have been taught by Theudas, the disciple of Paul, and Basilides claimed to have been taught by Glaucius, a disciple of Peter. And so we have these attestation chains like we do in early Islam. Oh yeah, we got the goods all right. We're not just making it up, though in fact no doubt they were, both the Gnostics, Catholics, and the early Muslims. But you wanted to outdo the other guy and say, look, I don't know where they're getting their crazy heresies, but we are in touch with the actual founder. And in the Gnostic case, well, that could mean the heavenly revealer, but more and more, I think the same way, they began to say, yeah, there was a visit to this earth of the Gnostic revealer, Jesus Christ, and our guys, Peter and the rest of them, were recipients of that. Though, of course, they taught these advanced doctrines only to the elite. That's why in Nag Hammadi you have the first and second apocalypses of James, the secret book of John, and all that stuff, like the Gospel of Thomas and Philip, where it's assumed that, yeah, there were the 12 apostles, but not all of them got the inside track information, as in Gospel of Thomas saying 13, where Jesus says that Thomas is the only one who's understood him. He takes him aside, tells him some deeper truths. The other apostles want to know what it was, but he says, "Look, I'm sorry if I told you. You wouldn't be able to handle it. You would stone me to death for blasphemy, and fire would erupt from the stones and consume you." Oh, holy mackerel! That reflects the Gnostic experience of being persecuted for daring to say what they, quote, knew, unquote. So, I think you would have a historical Jesus emerging for polemical, institutional reasons among Gnostics and others and Catholics at roughly the same time, part of the same debate. And so how are you going to effect that historicizing? Well, you don't do it de novo. You do it by rewriting these stories that are already at hand. And of course you could do that with the Old Testament, even if you repudiated the Old Testament, as Marcionites did. In fact, that, in a sense, is what necessitates such rewrites. Many people were used to it, kind of wanted to keep it, couldn't officially keep it, so let's rewrite it. In the same sort of way that Muslims say the Quran completes and clarifies the Bible, and yet it tends to rewrite many, many biblical stories, as if saying, however, these are new revelations. Allah has never revealed this about Abraham or Noah or Moses before. Okay, let me get back to the question. I'm sure there are huge problems with this. One I can see immediately is the duplication/rewriting of the section including the miraculous feeding. Mark wouldn't have created the same story twice, so we'd be left with Proto-Mark as the story creator, or else with someone rewriting Mark before Matthew got his hands on it. Yeah, I think that is one of the signs that whoever put this together combined stories that were already, let's say Old Testament stories, that were already being retold. There were different versions. He didn't want to leave either one of them out, so that would, in my opinion, imply that Mark didn't just create the whole darn thing. One guide, and much less the writer of our Gospel of Mark, did not fabricate the whole darn thing. Yeah, also, what about the 3 days prediction, ambiguous though it is? If there was never intended to be a physical resurrection, I guess the 3 days could refer to the heavenly death and resurrection, but I think that would be an odd thing to bring up before the high priest. But this is the Matthew thing, where after Jesus has been crucified, the Sanhedrin come to Pilate and say, that hoaxer said he would rise after 3 days. Well, this is all a Matthean creation, so you couldn't stick that on Mark, and it would certainly be a post-Markan development. On the other hand, the idea of a heavenly Christ for the masses does seem to explain why the writer needed a source of stories, why he would use a lower Christology, and why his Christianity would appear to be such a different strain than that of the purely heavenly version. To me, this makes more sense than a human Jesus independent of Paul, and yet somehow inheriting from the Christ myth. I tend to think that Docetism is the idea that, people saw and heard Jesus on earth, but he was really a kind of a phantom for the purposes of communication, right? A disembodied voice is going to cause more alarm than a apparent flesh and blood teacher. Well, I think that is, I speculate, right, that this was the result of trying to split the difference between a belief that there had never been any historical appearance of the heavenly Christ, and on the other hand, that, there had been, and that the split in the difference should come up with the idea that, okay, he seemed to be here, but he wasn't really. He would never actually take up a rotting vesture of sinful human flesh. I think you could, however, explain the Pauline. Even if you thought Pauline Christianity presupposed a historical Jesus, and I don't think it does, but if you did, you'd still have to ask, what does this have to do with a Christianity based on the idea of Jesus having these 12 lieutenants or successors? And that it mattered that there were 12 of them for the 12 tribes of Israel, and then this guy, the apostle to the nations, who has nothing to say about a historical Jesus. That seems just the number thing, right? The 12 and here comes Paul out of nowhere, out of left field. That makes me think that, we might have different groups, to take Burton Mack's terminology. We might have an eventual fusion of Jesus movements from Palestine and Christ cults from Syria and the Hellenistic world. That makes an awful lot of sense to me, and in fact I speculate that Jesus Christ is already a vestige of combining two different but analogous savior gods, and that would make a lot of sense if you had the Pauline Christ cult and the Jewish Christian Jesus movement. In Hinduism, you have such composite deities. Narayana Vishnu is the fusion of Narayana and a separate deity, Vishnu. The idea of the various avatars of Vishnu implies that they decided that various local deities must have been visitations of Vishnu once their local cults came under the larger umbrella of Vaishnavism. And similarly, what's his name? Vasudeva Krishna, probably two gods eventually fused together. There are instances in Egypt. One of the Ptolemaic emperors, in this case we actually know the guy who did it, fused Apis, the bull god, with Osiris, the dying and rising god, creating a new synthetic deity, Serapis, who was wildly popular. And there are other cases of it as well. And I think that's what's happened. The very name Jesus Christ is a composite name, which is why I hyphenated in my translation. Back to our questioner. As a follow-up question, if the first gospel were a deliberate fictionalizing of a heavenly Jesus, what would this do to the concept that a Jesus hero cult was part of the early Christian mix? Is there independent evidence that gospel material was created from an extant hero cult rather than the fictionalized history being written in the style of a hero stories? I think that there are stories that look in the Gospels that look very much like they have been borrowed from those of other divine heroes like Apollonius of Tyana and Pythagoras. So there may have been actual borrowings. Certainly the mythic hero archetype is in there with stories like the Annunciation, the miraculous conception, the child prodigy business, and even all the miracles that are designed to be the adventures of Superman. So what matters to me is that you can just see by comparison with these other hero cults that's what we're dealing with. We see the type of thing this is supposed to be. I do think, as I say, that some individual pieces from the other ones have circulated and wound up in the Jesus story. But again, if you have multiple Jesus movements and Christ cults coming together, like the dying and my favorite example would be the dying and rising God mystery religion contributes the salvific death of Jesus and the need for us to participate in it by sacramental initiation. Whereas in the Jesus hero cult, he may not even have died. I think, as you may know, that there are various hints in all four Gospels that they're working from an earlier version where Jesus cheated death. He didn't die and come back. He narrowly escaped it, which people did in ancient novels of the time. And that if he did die and rise, it had no salvific value. It was just part of the story of Jesus as a superhero. So the saving death of Jesus comes from the sacramental Jesus mystery religion, which was either a homegrown counterpart to Osiris and Attis and Adonis and Baal, or possibly was just a morphed version of it. So it almost doesn't matter. And finally, may the black sun forever curse you with wisdom. Abdel Daoud, first prophet of the Aten. First, you're not giving credit to Akhenaten? Well, you're number one with me, anyhow. Justin M. White from Tampa, Florida. Pretty nifty place. I'm working my way through A Wicked Company, The Forgotten Radicalism of the Enlightenment by Philip Blom, and wanted to share some fun tidbits with your listeners as well as follow up with a question. The premise of the book is to look at the much more radicalized women and men who interacted with the great figures of the Enlightenment that we learn about, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, etc., and find the hidden or subversive radicalism of others such as Diderot, I guess, who was mostly remembered for his work on the Encyclopedia. The faint memory of the radicalism of Diderot shows up today in the continued attempts to keep his remains out of the pantheon. Diderot was greatly impressed by Pierre Bayle, I took French years ago. I'm B-A-Y-L-E, Bayle, 1647 to 1706, whose dictionary, Dictionnaire, was a biographical treatment of philosophers of the past and present, and was often an introduction to atheist thought that would otherwise be unavailable to most readers. Bailey's argument on atheism, of course, Bailey's articles on atheism, of course, were couched in criticism and voluminous footnotes, but the reader is essentially left to his own conclusion. This was the path that Diderot took in his encyclopedia, giving it a very subversive angle. Articles on religion and philosophy would be carefully, sometimes absurdly orthodox. The article on the story of Noah used the work of Abbé, Father Edme Mallet, who knows what I'm saying, right? E-D-M-E, but E-D-M-E and last name M-A-L-L-E-T, who calculated how many species of animals there were on Earth, how many supplies they would need, including water, how animals would have to be distributed to keep the ark from capsizing, and how ventilation would have worked, and found that the ark would need to have taken on 9.6 million gallons of water, 47,000 cubic meters of hay, however many sheep and cattle to feed however many sheep and cattle to feed carnivores, etc. Obviously, it becomes much harder to take the story seriously when you attempt to take it literally. Ain't it the truth? The myths in other religions were suspiciously close to Christian tales. I'm sorry, I don't know what's the matter with me today. The myths in other religions that were suspiciously close to Christian tales were also taken down with orthodox-sounding fervor. Virgin birth in Egyptian myth, a Roman cult with a dove, preposterous fairy tales. The entry on Eucharist even had a note, "See cannibalism." My question is, with a skeptical tradition that goes back over 300 years in Western Europe, why are educated people still having such a hard time accepting something like the Christ myth theory? Most who remain theists have jettisoned the virgin birth, the empty tomb, perhaps even the coming of the Holy Spirit on Jesus, and almost every other aspect of the narrative as embellishment. Do you see a connection between the hesitancy to teach about these radical elements of the Enlightenment in high schools and colleges, with the hesitancy of mature intellectuals to tackle the possibility of mythicism? There's this tendency of what I call the stuck in the middle with you approach, that if there is an extreme view, that is, there's a range of views, you just figure, well, the truth has to be somewhere in the middle. I don't see why that would be true. I mean, given that there are plenty of lunatic views on things, I think that inclines people to say, well, if it's true in one case, then it's true in all these subjects. I think it's a kind of either an inability or an unwillingness to propose and to promote minority theories. Now, that you'd think people would take the opportunity to scrutinize all theories and see what evidence there is for them, but there tends to be a kind of prejudicial dismissal of things like the Christ myth theory. And then you have to ask, well, why is that? I mean, you look at the statements made against it, and they tend to be cursory dismissals or circularity, or and I think it's just a kind of an inertia and a reluctance to be thought a nut, because one fears that that way lies madness, and that it's like people that say, whether they have or not, I don't know, they say they have seen a flying saucer. In fact, I've heard tales from eyewitnesses that I can't really explain away, but or people with near-death experiences. In the beginning, they wouldn't share it with other people. Same thing with the UFO things. They figure, I know what I saw, but I don't dare talk about it because I will be inviting people to think I'm a nut. So I'm keeping mum. It's not really going to do any good for me to tell anybody, and it is going to do me harm. So, and I don't know how consciously that happens with theories, but I suspect it does. They're just sticking too close to the scholars are with their traditional religious background. Partly, this is because of what Hector Avalos says, that there is a kind of liberal, even secular apologetics for the Bible that is just a hangover from the days in which those scholars believed in it, that they can't quite get it out of their system. And then also, I think, like there's the Fox News phenomenon. I know all of you think I'm insane for liking Fox News and approving of their coverage and analysis, but I must say that when I see all the faux news business and all that stuff, it seems to me that these critics have never watched it and are just victims and promoters of propaganda. They don't like what is being disclosed, and so they try to just vilify and demonize it. So there, I think their political ideology, the critics of this network, that very much controls their criticism. And in the same way, certain ideas fit together. If to take Fox News again, they tend to think that atheists and free thinkers and the like, being by and large leftists, liberals, progressives, whatever, and I'm sure they're right about that, they figure, I think, that, well, then these religious or anti-religious views they espouse must be apologetics for the progressives' attack on traditional values and traditional culture. So seeing it as all part of the same agenda, the Fox news network, always practices apologetics, or if they ever get that far. I mean, they push William Lane Craig and these other dubious characters because they see an attack on traditional Orthodox Christianity as an attack on Western culture. Well, Ibn Warwick and myself and others see that, and the whole group conservative atheists, we see that it's just it's not so, that they're different issues, and you can't. We don't have the same sacred canopy the West once did. We don't derive, or at least legitimatize, our values by referring them all to a supernatural backstory. I think that in a way one's ideological commitments on cultural and political issues have some control over what one thinks about issues like the historical Jesus, the Christ myth theory, even if you don't explicitly realize that. And I think that I noticed Bart Ehrman says that he equates Christ mythicism with the people that believe that Obama was not actually born in the United States. Well, I have to, though it's a moot point, I have to admit, I think as a historical critic, I see real reason to question whether his birth certificates, plural, are legitimate. Again, it's a moot point, but it seems to me there really is a question there. And yet I know to say that makes me look like a lunatic because of the way people take it as a function of a political stance. Well, it isn't in my case. I don't think it really ultimately matters, but just as an interesting question, I think, yeah, there is some reason to believe there's a kind of a hoax here. Again, who cares? I don't, anyway. Well, in the same way, you don't want to be tarred with the brush of a theory that seems radical. Something being out of the mainstream is already an argument against it. Now, all of this should be moot. One should just look at the evidence for any contested theory. But in my opinion, people writing against the Christ myth theory are not really doing that. The arguments we are given are vapid and amazingly bad. Maybe there are better arguments. I'd like to hear them. So all of that to say that there's a lot of reasons, possible ones, why people don't take seriously this theory that I think should. I tend to think it's not like Mary Baker Eddy in Christian Science. It's more like continental drift, universally ridiculed until it finally turns out to be right. But who knows? I mean, all you can finally do is create your own opinion. It doesn't make if it's true, and of course we don't even know that. It won't make it more true if everybody starts jumping on the bandwagon and espousing it. You know, you just got to look at the facts for yourself and make what sense of them you can. And I do not accuse any writer of of the kind of sleight of hand and the self-deception I've just described. I'm no mind reader. How would I know? It's just that when I see certain cases that seem cogent to me just being cursorily dismissed and laughed off, I gotta wonder why. But that's all it comes to. Who knows? You can only speculate about that and continue to look at the facts. That is way too much of an answer. I guess I'm rambling today. Must be the barometric pressure. Anyway, this is from Tim D. Williamson, a.k.a. Big Blue Frog, stargazer, code monkey, soothsayer, bug fabricator, uber geek, skeptic, and purveyor of obscure trivia. And that's only part of the resume. He says, as far as the atonement value of Christ's death, if it's supposed to be analogous to all the pre-Jesus sacrifices to Yahweh, then why didn't Jesus stay dead? After all, those uncounted lambs, oxen, goats, trees, sloths, and breakfast cereals that were sacrificed didn't come back after 3 days. Unless you were one of the priests who ate part of the sacrifice and it didn't agree with you. I guess it might not have waited 3 days to come back. But I think that's true. Thomas Altizer, he's not the only one, but he sticks out in my mind as making the most of this theologically, saying, if you're talking about Christ dying for you, what sense does that make if he springs right back as if he was in a Houdini stunt? Everybody else who dies stays dead. Well, of course, the theological answer to that would be, well, no, they don't. One day there'll be a resurrection. So with Jesus, it just happened early. He's the first fruits of the resurrection. That makes a certain amount of sense. It might render it meaningful, but still, the guy took only 6 hours to die by crucifixion, and then after a couple of days, he rose from the dead. What kind of sacrifice is this? I don't totally dismiss it. I see the what John Hick would call eschatological vindication option, but that is a huge sore thumb that sticks out, it seems to me. And no other. Well, are all those? But you still have a point beyond that, right? Because is there going to be a resurrection of all the bullocks and goats and all that stuff too? Well, you could say it's just an analogy. It's just that in certain respects, the bloodshed of Christ atones or expiates, as these others did. Yeah, that's possible. But you would have to start drawing fine distinctions, but you're raising a big question that I think a lot of believers would not take as threats, but just as challenges to explore and refine the thing further, and that's a real good contribution. Let's see this from Eric Hildeman. I was wondering what your opinion might be regarding the hypothesis that the historical Paul might have been a Herodian prince, possibly even the nephew of Herod Agrippa I. Some theologians seem to like this idea, A.N. Wilson, for example. Of course, in your book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, you make a good case for Paul being a reflection of the character Simon Magus. But could Paul also have been related to one of the Herods who ruled Judea? I'd greatly value your input. My input ain't going to be that valuable, Eric, I'm afraid. I don't know enough about this, though I have read what I'm sure must be the best case for this by Robert Eisenman. I think this appears in one of his books, but he originally wrote this as an article for the Journal of Higher Criticism, Was Paul a Herodian? And he makes a good case for it. It makes a lot of sense to me. There are a number of interesting pointers to that. they're not explicit, but it's pretty. It really makes you think. I don't know that it's more than speculation, but then again, my views are certainly speculative on this, and I would see what he had to say about it. I don't know if this is incorporated into the New Testament code or into a collection of his articles about the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Christianity. But I would check out what he has to say about it, because I find it pretty compelling, though he's still working with the idea of the traditional view of Paul being essentially sound. He doesn't go in for the crazy views I hold on it, but his view is a good alternative, and it's not impossible that it could fit the Simon Magus view, since on my reading, Simon Magus in Josephus is tied in with that circle of people, with the Herodians and so forth, and Herod Agrippa II and such. So I wouldn't be too surprised if both were true, but I'd look up Eisenman on that. He is an amazing scholar. Joshua Hartel says, I've been listening to your wonderful podcast, The Human Bible, on iTunes lately, and came across a very interesting episode where you indicated a relationship between the tree of knowledge and sex. I've been looking for scholarly works related to this topic and having a hard time. Could you please recommend some books or journal articles that address this topic? I'm a graduate student and can access databases for scholarly works. Let's see. I am not sure any longer where I first read this. I may have something more detailed. I do make the case a bit more for it in the book Evolving Out of Eden by myself and Ed Suominen, and I would take a look at that in the Eden section. I think it's called Eden Disorder, but it's certainly in there. Beyond that, I have to admit I can't quite think of it. Usually other aspects or possible readings of the story get more airplay. I know I'm not the only one or the first to say this, but I can't quite remember offhand where I came up with it. It makes a lot of sense in the context, and I do explain that in Evolving Out of Eden. Sorry about that, Joshua. Pretty skimpy. By the way, I will be doing new human Bibles pretty soon now. John Felix tells me that there's only one of the ones I did, over a year ago for CFI, that they were releasing sporadically. It was supposed to be every couple of weeks and was much, much delayed many times. But once those are done, I'll start doing new ones. I've certainly got a lot of good material people have sent me for many more shows, and I'll be doing them on a more regular basis every 2 or 3 weeks, and hope you'll continue to enjoy it. John D. says, I've been reading the book Outlines of Pyrrhonism. Pyrrho the Skeptic, at Pyrrhonism, by Sextus Empiricus, and came across a few sections I thought would be interesting. It is an act of piety to offer goats to Artemis, but not to Asclepius. And I might add a host of similar instances, but I forbear, since my aim is to be brief. Yet surely if a sacrifice had been holy by nature or unholy, it would have been deemed so by all men alike. Similar examples... No, I think this is still... this is still a quote. Examples similar to these may also be found in the religious observances with regard to human diet. For a Jew or an Egyptian priest would sooner die than eat swine's flesh. By Libyan it is regarded as a most impious thing to eat a dove, and by others to eat sacrificial victims. I recall you discussing how ancient Israel was under Egyptian control and how that had influenced their later stories of Joseph being sold into slavery, the Exodus, and Moses, which is an Egyptian name. Did the Jewish people get the prohibition on barbecue pork sandwiches originally from the Egyptians? Let's see. It could be. It could be. That would be a kind of a similar theory to the long-standing one that they just were taking the Amish attitude toward the Prussians, that when they got into Canaan, they, on principle, repudiated pork because it was the chosen sacrificial animal of certain Canaanite gods, and their idea was, well, if they're doing it, we're doing the opposite. I don't think that holds much water, because it turns out that the Israelites simply were Canaanites. They were cut from the same cloth and not even really cut. They belonged to the same blanket as the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Amorites and all those guys. So that probably doesn't exactly fit. I recommend again the great essay by Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, called The Abominations of Leviticus. I kind of summarize some of her theories in some of my books, always acknowledging her. But I don't go into the whole reason for all of the laws like she does. And the reason it seems to be rejected in the dietary laws, the kosher laws of the Bible, is that the pig violates, transgresses the boundaries between the categories of creation as the Jewish priests mapped them out. They had an elaborate taxonomy, and they had the ideas of what makes something a true bird, a true fish, a true animal, and all that. Well, if a particular one failed in some way to meet the ideal definition, then it was off the menu. You couldn't eat lobster or shrimp, etc., because it wasn't a true fish. The ideal type of a fish was a creature with fins and scales, and that lived in the water. That had to do with locomotion. How does it get around? Okay, it swims with fins, and of course it's in the water. Something like a lobster is in the water, but it does not have fins and scales and doesn't swim. It crawls. Ooh, sorry about that. Charlie the tuna actually does make the cut, but Larry the lobster does not, and Sal the shrimp, he's out. Then it's a recurrent pattern that goes through all of these holiness laws. And why can't you eat pig? Well, because a true livestock animal is one that has cloven hooves and chews the cud. Uh-oh, what's this? Porky has the right hooves but does not chew the cud, which of course means you have a preliminary chewing of the cellulose or whatever, but it's pretty stiff stuff, and so it goes down to stomach number 1 to get broken down by the stomach acid, but not sufficiently, so it goes back up into the cow's mouth, and he or she chews it more and then sends it down to another stomach, and so forth, until the cellulose is completely dissolved and the nutrient digested. That's chewing the cud. Pigs don't do it, and so they're off the list. Now, the question in my mind is, were some of these rationalizations of traditional taboos, or, as it seems a little more likely to me, was the whole thing cooked up as an elaborate system that then eliminated from the menu certain critters that had been eaten? After all, you don't have the law prohibiting things that no one is doing anyway, right? So it kind of implies that people were having yummy pork barbecue sandwiches. Oh, that I lived in. I suffer like Job for the fact that I don't live in a part of the country where they have famous Dave's barbecue joints. Of course, you do have great barbecue here in eastern North Carolina, which I partake of frequently. But famous Dave's, oh boy. Well, anyway, but it could be that they inherited this from Egypt, and it just happened to fit with this systematic thing that the scribes created. Now, how did the Egyptians determine what was culturally and dietarily kosher? Well, we don't know, but one thing Mary Douglas points out is that in all cultures you do have these systems. Whether anybody ever sat down and blueprinted them, as it seems like the Levites did in the Bible, well, that's usually unknown. I don't think it's enough evidence in most of the cases, but she gives examples from various cultures, and they're not all that similar. Different animals, well, just look at India and Pakistan, right? In India, the cow is sacred. You don't eat it. But beef, sure, pork, what the heck? No problem there. But over in Muslim Pakistan, it's just the opposite. Have all the hamburgers you want, beef burgers, but you don't eat those stinking pigs, and they certainly have inherited that from Judaism. And so who knows how it happens. I mean, I like to say that we sort of cross over the kosher laws, those of us who are not Jews, when we are happy to have lobster, shrimp, and all these other critters, the Popeyes, crawfish. Oh boy, are they great. No problem there. But if somebody said, hey, would you care to have some of these cockroaches? No thanks, and you head for the restaurant bathroom to vomit. Right? What's the difference? There's only a hair's breadth of difference between crustaceans and insects. They're all arthropods, but we have inherited a distaste for some things that are hardly different from what we like to eat. I mean, how would palmetto bugs in butter sauce be? Well, I'm not going to try to find out, but some are already chowing down on them. And like we find it abhorrent that anybody would eat horse meat or dog meat, and there are plenty of jokes about that. But there's other cultures where, what's the big deal? Are you folks crazy for not liking it? Hard to say why, but I think we do have a pretty good idea in the case of the Bible. Okay, this is from Freddie. This may be old hat, but I was struck by the similarity of Deuteronomy's giving of the law on the plains of Moab instead of Mount Sinai to Luke's sermon. It was pretty interesting. To Luke's sermon on the flat land instead of Matthew's sermon on the mount. Clearly, the Old Testament writers did not regard their scriptures as a fixed canon, nor, it seems, did Luke. Yeah, I think you're right there. The Old Testament writers clearly knew of the Sinai tradition because they stressed that only the Decalogue was given there. Is this not a strong indication that Luke knew Matthew's gospel and felt the need to change it? No, I don't think so, because though that would, be a workable model for redaction criticism, it's equally likely, if not more, that Matthew and Luke both had access to Q, which already had the sermon section, probably shorter and much more like Luke's, though I would guess minus the woes to the rich and the happy and the well-filled and all that. Luke is certainly redacting a sermon, but my guess is that and of course there would have been no narrative setting in Q, since they're working what they do use of the Q sermon into their own narratives, they have to give it a location. And we know that both Luke and Matthew are trying to depict Jesus as a new Moses, among other things. And I would guess, and Luke has a special interest in Deuteronomy, the whole central section of Luke, as I think C.F. Evans pointed out, is a kind of, he didn't use this terrible word, but a Deuteronomy, that he's trying to have Jesus give his own Deuteronomy, because if you compare the wording and the topics in the same order largely between the central section, or the travel narrative as it's also called, of Luke to Deuteronomy, it cannot be coincidence, the astonishing correspondence between them. Sometimes the same topics are dealt with in different ways because it is a new Deuteronomy. But it can't be a coincidence, and nor can it be in Matthew, where he jams the teaching of Jesus into 5 big hunks. Even though he has to cheat a little bit, he really puts 2 topics together: the denunciations of the Pharisees and the Olivet Discourse. But why does he do that? Because he wants to come up with 5 books of a new Torah from a new Moses establishing a new covenant. And so they both, it's not surprising that both evangelists would choose a Mosaic location for the delivery of the law. But Luke, especially liking Deuteronomy, would choose the plains, as you say. I never thought of that before. And Matthew could have done that, but he happened to pick the mountain because of the association that you point out of Mount Sinai and the commandments. A very sharp eye. Color Me Canadian says, let's see, I hope I do have the right. Yeah, okay. In Acts and Christian Beginnings, the authors posit that Luke gave Paul the pre-conversion name of Saul to emphasize his Jewishness. They further argue that Acts' depictions of Paul's conversion experiences are based on Euripides' The Bacchae, where the god asks the king, Pentheus, who is persecuting his followers, "Why do you kick at the goads?" In Acts, the voice of Jesus tells Paul almost exactly the same thing. If so, could Luke have chosen Saul as Paul's pre-conversion name? Paul never calls himself that in his own letters. To heighten the parallels? If instead of Dionysus asking a Greek king why he's futilely going up against a god, Luke has his God, Jesus, asking a Jew named after a Jewish king why he's futilely going up against God. I never thought of that, and it is an interesting puzzle, and that might well be correct. Yeah, there are numerous striking parallels between the Bacchae and the book of Acts. I go into more detail about this in my introduction to Luke and Acts in the pre-Nicene New Testament and the very soon-to-appear Human Bible New Testament. And but the name thing, that didn't occur to me, that he wants a king, so he says, well, Saul's pretty close to Paul. Though I think it's also possible that he got the name from his other major source for the Pauline conversion narrative, namely 2 Maccabees chapter 3, where Heliodorus is sent by the Seleucid emperor to appropriate money from the Jewish temple. And there is a character named Saul, and a character, I think Saul, and a character named Kish, which is Saul's father in the Old Testament, and Tarsus. And so it could have to do with that as well. Or it's possible someone is trying to split the difference between Simon or Shimeon and Paul by naming the guy Shaul, the Hebrew for Saul. Could be. I don't know. But that is very interesting. I've learned something here today, and more than one thing. Appreciate that. Charles Minus says, Dear Uber Geek, this is a question regarding the historicity of David. I've been listening to the excellent Yale series of lectures on the Hebrew Bible given by Professor Christine Hayes. She says that the current scholarly opinion is that there was an historical King David. She said that this position is largely based on the 1993 discovery of the Tel Dan Stele, an Aramaean stone inscription from around 950 BCE containing the phrase, the House of David. I'm only a bumbling layperson, but I failed to be convinced by this artifact. There appears to me to be a logical error in this. A reference to something called the House of David does not prove the existence of David. The Emperor of Japan claimed to be descended from heaven, but that does not prove the existence of heaven. Similarly, the fact that there was a Christian church in the 1st or 2nd century does not prove the existence of Jesus. It seems to me that what could be going on in the Tel Dan Stele is similar to your and others' hypothesis that the historicization of Jesus was a means of gaining credibility, that is, the shake the hand that shook the hand argument. I suspect this may have been discussed by the Old Testament minimalists, but I haven't had the opportunity to review their work, and eagerly await your promised book on that school. Yeah, the Moses and minimalism thing. You got a real good point. It's pretty clear that, well, like the house of Iulus, Julius Caesar, his ancestors traced themselves back to Aeneas. And was there really an Aeneas and a Trojan War and all that? Well, Schliemann, to the contrary, notwithstanding, that's highly doubtful. It's certainly mythical, whether the myth has any history behind it or not. Same thing here. I have a hunch that Dr. Hayes is identifying the school of thought that she finds convincing with the scholarly opinion, because my impression of reading the minimalists is they say, no, there's no reason to think that there was a David, and everything that is said about him, that he built this great palace on Mount Zion, and that Solomon built the great temple after him, there's no evidence of these structures. So that leaves you with a King David that is kind of like King Arthur. Okay, we know all the stories of Camelot and the Round Table and all that stuff are myths. No real history corresponds to them. But it could be that there was some Celtic war chief in Roman Britain that might have given rise to King Arthur, but who knows? Right? I mean, that's possible, but not particularly probable. And I would think with the same thing here, that there might have been a David, but David could mean beloved or chieftain or something, so it's hard to say. Plus, there's always the problem that there's so many faked artifacts, some of which have been considered genuine for a long time, that I would have to see that whole thing reopened. Is this Tel Dan item genuinely old, or is it like some of these other things that were held on to by defenders of William Foxwell Albright and other conservatives for a long time now? Okay, well, I guess I'm going to stop it there and get to work on back to work on my book Holy Fable, and I'll see you pretty soon. Still got loads of good questions to get through, but that shouldn't stop you from adding more to the rain barrel, so I'm hoping I'll see more from you. Thanks for being with us on the Bible Geek today, and have a happy new year.
In the Bible we are told, in that ancient lore of old.
The Bible Geek was recorded by Robert M. Price and produced by John Felix and Sergeant Jovanovich. Theme song by John Morris. Visit us at robertmprice.mindvendor.com For more info on Robert's projects, purchase Bible Geek merchandise and click the ever-important Donate button. Send your questions to criticus@aol.com and be sure to rate and review the Bible Geek on iTunes. Thanks for listening to the Bible Geek. I'm Torrin Anderson.
Placed on the firing line, so you'd better brush the dust from that old Bible and look up to the stars when they shine.